You're listening to an Anazao Ministries podcast. Have you ever wondered whether or not your faith can be logical? If you're looking for a podcast with all the answers around your faith and logic to help you better defend your beliefs, then you've come exactly to the wrong place. But if you're looking for a show that's going to help you ask better questions, to challenge your beliefs and engage better with logicians and theologians from the last 2,000 years that will leave you struggling with what you believe about the divine at all, then you found the perfect show for you. This is a show designed to give you more questions than answers. I am Joshua Noel, and I'm just a dummy who loves God and theology and hopes to show my love for God by studying and thinking deeply about topics people smarter than me have been thinking about for thousands of years now. So we are in season 2. We're talking about logical fallacies, and our faith, as we talked about last time, should not be fallitic. It shouldn't be illogical. We might not be able to prove our faith with reason or with logic, but we should be able to keep from being illogical in our beliefs and with our faith. So that's what we're looking at throughout this thing. Look back, last episode, we discussed why I believe that to be the case. Today, we're just going to go right into the fallacy. We're going to be talking about a slippery slope fallacy. And what exactly is a slippery slope fallacy? So first, we need to define what it is. For me, it's always harder to define some of these fallacies in just terms rather than examples. So we're going to be doing examples all throughout the episode to just kind of show what we're talking about. But I'm how to define it. It is essentially what the slippery slope fallacy is you take one thing that you don't agree with, and you say that this will cause this other thing that will cascade to this other thing that will cascade to this other thing. And it's basically a type of fear mongering. So a lot of our topics today be around why we shouldn't use fear for our logic. So some of the examples, because again, I know that was not a wonderful explanation of what the slippery slope fallacy is. So just hang in there with me. One that helps me is thinking of a parent who might be doing a great job at parenting, we don't know, who does not want to allow their child to have a candy bar and says, if I let them have this candy bar, then my kid will be fat. So that is an example of a slippery slope fallacy. That is not reasonable. Your kid very well could eat that candy bar, have really high metabolism, be fine. Maybe eat that candy bar, discover they don't like candy. There are all kinds of things that could happen. That doesn't necessarily mean that having that one candy bar will cause your kid to be fat. What you're doing, usually, there's a lot of presumed cascading effects in there. My kid will have this candy bar, then they will want more, then they'll get more and more and more. They'll become addicted to sugar. Then one day that will lead them to being fat and maybe having diabetes and maybe death. So you see how that it starts with this fear and it cascades and gets bigger and bigger and bigger. But there's lots of reasonable things. There's a lot of ways to be mature, to say, hey, I'm going to eat healthily and once every Friday have a candy bar. There are ways that you can have a candy bar and not be fat. Your kid eating a candy bar does not necessarily mean that your kid will be fat. So that is why it is a logical fallacy. Now, there might be other reasons that your kid shouldn't have candy bars. Maybe they'll be too hyper with sugar. Maybe they'll, there's all kinds of things. I'm not saying it is bad to keep your child from having a candy bar. I am saying that series of logic, as I laid out, is a fallacy and should be avoided. So here's another one. Drinking age should be lowered. So that is an argument. And the argument against it sometimes is a bit of a slippery slope fallacy. So if we lower the drinking age, everyone will start getting drunk. People will be driving drunk and be acting crazy. Children will start getting drunk, and then everyone will die and the world will burn. However it may go. But you see that slippery slope. If we lower the drinking age, kids will start drinking. If we lower the drinking age, everyone's going to start drinking. Then this will happen, and then this will happen. And you're presuming things without any logical reason to believe that will be the case, especially when we know other countries, lots of other countries other than the United States, have a much lower drinking age than 21, and none of these things have happened there. So we know that logically, lowering the drinking age does not necessarily mean that our children will become drunks. That does not mean that there aren't logical reasons to be worried about that or other reasons to be concerned about the drinking age. It's just saying that particular line of thought is illogical and, again, should be avoided. So that's what we're talking about when we talk about the slippery slope fallacy. So I want to give you some examples from some bigger examples. So those are just surface level kind of understanding. What is this fallacy? What are we talking about? If we're talking about some of the bigger examples, there's a few, I think, from our own modern times that we can see this and we see it used prevalently and poorly because, again, it's a fallacy. So a lot of times you might hear people on the left side of politics, especially in America, or who are maybe they'll call themselves more progressive, will say something along the lines of, if conservatives take this right, then they're going to start taking this and this and this next. That is an example of a slippery slope fallacy. So, you plug in whatever, if they take away reproduction rights, if they take away gay rights, then they're going to go after this next, and they're going to go after that after this. That's fear. The slippery slope. That does not necessarily mean if they take away one right that they will then go after this other right. And that's just assuming that your wording of them taking away the right is correct in the first place, which, hey, this isn't a political show. We're not going to get into that. We're just talking about the fallacy itself. That is something that we should be concerned of. It's something we should avoid. Conservatives do it to Democrats as well, right? Usually it's, well, if we start allowing gay marriage, then we're going to have to allow this, then we're going to have to allow this, et cetera, et cetera. But right now, just looking at if they take this right thing, there are some examples. If we're talking about the Supreme Court in America, again, if they are ruling on something, Roe v. Wade, they overturned that. You could use it and say, well, if they use that same logic, then they might overturn this. And if they use that same logic, then they might do that. That's not a slippery slope. That is just showing how the logic would work one place, the same in another place. That's completely reasonable. But a lot of times that's not what happens. A lot of times they took this away and now they're going to take this away. And you're not actually looking at why did they rule that way? And how would that reasoning apply in somewhere else? Usually it's just a cascading fear. And that is the fallacy. Sorry. So here's another. We're here for it. We're going to the X-Men. The X-Men, all over the place. We see this fallacy used against the X-Men. And sometimes on the same side as the X-Men, depending if you're on Magneto's side or not. So in X-Men comics, there is a lot of politics around people who are born with mutant power. Should they be registered? Should we try to keep them alive at all? Should we lock people up? What do we do with people who are born with these superhuman abilities? Because if we allow someone like Wolverine with sharp claws to just go around without any restraints, then he could start killing people. And then that might turn around with people killing people on the other side. And we might have all out war. And you see, then. Slippery slope fallacy. Same thing on the other side. If we're looking at like Magneto's people, that is like they're worried that people are trying to confine the X-Men and are being prejudiced against the mutants. They say, so what's next? Next, they're going to lock us up. But then after that, they're going to do this. And even though there are some former examples of some of that, so it's not completely one-to-one, you still see Magneto using this slippery slope fallacy thinking of, oh, well, because this happened, now they're going to go this other step. And then after that, they're going to take this other step against us. And it's a lot of fear wrapped up in that. Again, it is a fallacy. So Bob Jones University, as well as many other Christian universities and Christian thinkers, not that long ago, 20, 30 years ago, were still against marriages, interracial marriages. Black and white woman, other different races being married, they thought were wrong. There were several reasons behind this, but a big one that they really stood their ground on why it lasted so long. Bob Jones University didn't change their policy officially till the year 2000. Concerning interracial marriage. And a lot of it because of fear. They said, if we allow this, then next we'll have to allow same-sex marriage. And then next we'll allow this. And then next this. So it's that fear of, if we allow interracial marriages, the next will be same-sex marriages. That's a slippery slope argument. There's nothing that says necessarily because you allowed this, you will have to allow the next. There's no logical through line. It's just a slippery slope. Now, a lot of the thinking was actually from bad hermeneutics, and we'll get to that later, where they were actually using a verse that talked about don't marry people, don't be unequally yoked. And they thought that had to do with marriage, so they applied it to this. And they said, hey, here, if we allow this, then we'll have to allow people to marry under other contexts that we don't like. So we stand our ground here so it doesn't get worse. Any kind of thinking like that should be classified as slippery slope. You should see that as dangerous, see it as fueled by fear. And the Bible says we are not given a spirit of fear, but of love, of joy, strength, right? So look at that and say, hey, that is not of God. That thinking is not of God. That thinking is not logical, and there's no room for it in my faith. And I hope you can say the same about yours. All right, so let's get on to some practical theology. Ways maybe this kind of thinking holds us back. Maybe it holds us back in who we vote for. You can't vote, again, going back to an American context, I can't vote for a Democrat because if I do, then they're going to allow abortion, and then they're going to allow up to the day of abortion. And then that's going to allow for people who don't care about life at all. And then we're going to stop going to church. And then if no one goes to church, then our country is going to be full of Satanists and, then. And then is the phrase of slippery slopes. Or on the other side, if I allow him in, they're going to do this 2025 plan. They're going to ban gay marriage and abortion. And the next, they're going to take away women's rights. And then after that, we're going to be living in the bridesmaid or whatever, like the then. Instead of seeing, hey, we're given an opportunity in our country to vote, and we can use our beliefs as Christians to say what lines up closest to mine. None of them are, there is no Christian option. But what lines up closest, what can I feel best about? Because I am told by the Bible to engage in my community and engage in our politics. And I need to do that in the way that's closest to God as I see fit without holding other people to what I see, right? Because maybe I think that the Bible commands us to care for immigrants, to care for the poor and the needy. And that leads me to vote for a Democratic Party in America. And maybe someone else says, oh, how could you do that? Because, I think that what's more important is we stand up for the rights of babies being born, the rights of life, or whatever else that conservative stands for, religious freedom, freedom of speech. Those are also Christian values. It's possible to take one stance and disagree with someone and just realize that they have a point too, instead of saying, well, if you're doing that, you're trying to have babies killed and then you're going to have our rights taken away. Then you're going to, no, then, slippery slope. Let's avoid it. Another way that this practically might be holding us back. Who do we let our children hang out with? My kids can't hang out with people of another religion, because what if they start believing it? And then once they start believing it, they'll never want to go to church again. And then if they stop going to church, then their life will fall apart. They won't be blessed by God. And then. Hold us back with who our children come out. Maybe your children will hang out with somebody, and instead of being tempted to go their way, start telling them about Jesus and the stuff that you told your children about. And then maybe they'll be great witnesses. Maybe the exact opposite of what you think will happen. Instead, the other child will be blessed and come into church and become better. There's no logical reason, I think, just because your kid hangs out with someone, that this whole slippery slope thing will happen. Who are we willing to talk to and to be around ourselves? That's another way we're held back. Like, I don't want to be around people who use that kind of language, because what if I use that kind of language? And then what if I say it at church? And then what if my church doesn't like me anymore? What if I become, the kind of person who just cusses and drinks all the time like they are? What if, and then, what if? There's no logical through line. If you can't put together, I see that now here's an example that could be logical. I know I have a history of drinking problems. So maybe I don't want to hang out with people who drink, because I know that I am tempted in that. That is reasonable. That is me looking at a real reason why I might be tempted and why something might happen, and then avoiding a bad situation. Instead of saying, what if I do this? And then, without any real reason to back it up. So you have to have some substance. It's not that this kind of thinking is always wrong. It's that you have to have some kind of substance other than just these presupposed what if scenarios that don't have any basis in reality. We also see this in some of our Pharisee-like rules, and even in the Pharisees themselves. So if you go to the Bible, the Pharisees have all these extra rules. You can't do this on the Sabbath. You can't, take a shower. You can't do this. You can't turn the light switch, because what if that counts as work? Lots of crazy extra stuff that they do. We can't eat this because that might lead to eating this, and we can't drink this because that might make us do this. And what the rules existed, the Pharisee rules, a lot of them was putting rules in place so that you don't eventually do something else that will be a sin. So it's like rules before you break the real rules kind of deal. And that happens in churches even today. I can give one example from a church denomination I used to be a part of. When my dad and my grandfather, when my dad was first preaching, my grandfather, they first met, there was still a rule in the church against bowling. Because they believed if you were bowling, you were around a bunch of other people who were drinking and cussing, and then you wouldn't go with that lifestyle then. Instead of seeing that maybe you can bowl during the day, maybe you can have fun, maybe you don't have to be around any of the cussing and stuff at all. And maybe even if you are, you could be a light in the world and show people Jesus. They didn't see that. They saw the event. They saw the fear, that slippery slope. My dad instead actually saw that bowling was a lot of fun and that there wasn't anything in the Bible about bowling, and he enjoyed it. And my grandfather eventually saw that my dad preached great and still bowled. So my grandfather went and found out he loves bowling. So that was an example of them discovering a slippery slope that created a rule in the church that they didn't need. Maybe someone did. Maybe someone couldn't be around a lot of stuff in bowling and they needed that rule. But my dad and my grandfather didn't need that rule. And it was based off of a logical fallacy. If we lose some of this logical fear, we can better live in and show the freedom and love of Jesus. The Bible talks a lot about how they're going to know us from our love for one another. They're going to know us because those who Christ set free are free indeed. Freedom and love are who people are supposed to know the church, not by our rules, not by our fear, not by we're Republicans and not Democrats, not because we're Democrats and not Republicans, not because we defend these rights and not those rights. People also know us from our freedom, from our love. And having these slippery slope arguments that have us so afraid to do anything because what might happen next? And then thens prevent us from practically living out and showing the love and freedom that comes with following Jesus Christ. Okay, so next we're going to go on to some biblical theology. So biblically, we talked about earlier how people misunderstood that verse that talks about being unequally yoked. If you look at it, in 2 Corinthians 6 is where this comes from. It has nothing to do with racism. It has nothing to do with, marrying the same race or marrying people from the same denomination. People still use this verse out of context. Say, oh, you shouldn't marry someone who's not a Christian, or you shouldn't marry someone who doesn't have the same, if you're a Baptist, you shouldn't marry a Pentecostal. If you're a Pentecostal, you shouldn't marry a Methodist. People use this to be unequally yoked. That's what it's talking about. It's not talking about marriage at all. If you read the whole chapter, it's talking about one community of people. The church in Corinth are being told to not be part of a different community of people who are associated with doing dark, evil, twisted things. And, I think we can all agree. The church should not take place in the club downtown while people are snorting cocaine or whatever else they're doing there. The church should be separate from those things. But the people of the church should be engaging in the dark, being lights in the dark. And you shouldn't be afraid to marry someone because they believe slightly differently. There might be reasons that Christians shouldn't marry non-Christians, but it should not be based off of this verse because this verse has nothing to do with that. But people misuse the verse because of their fear. They are like, oh, then. There's a slippery slope. We need to avoid that. So if you marry someone, then all of a sudden you're not believing like them. And then all of a sudden you're both going to hate God. And then all of a sudden you're both going to be in hell one day. Well, if you don't have a reason to see why that might happen, that's just a slippery slope. There's no logical through line that being married will lead to you being just like your partner. Me and my wife are not exactly the same. We've been married 4 years, and there's some stuff that I still don't think we will ever see eye to eye on. And we're okay with that. Some of my friends are Christians married to non-Christians, and they've both changed some. Christian's still a Christian. The non-Christian's still a non-Christian, and it works fine. It is okay. It is sometimes hard because, if you're a Christian and you believe in an afterlife like hell, and you're not a universalist like I am, well, then you do have a certain set of challenges where you think your spouse might go to hell one day. And that could be really hard to overcome. But just because it's difficult does not mean it's impossible. And that slippery slope argument should not be the reason you avoid it. There might be other reasons, but it should not be because you're afraid that this will happen, and then this will happen. No, that's not a good reason. Another argument that people use with the Bible, that's a slippery slope argument. Some people say, well, if the Bible isn't all true, then how can we believe any of it? There are a lot of times it's used in Genesis 1. We think that Genesis 1 isn't literal. A lot of us don't think it is, myself included. We think that evolution may have happened and that some of these chapters aren't literal. Now, some people say, well, if it's not literal, then how do we know any of it's literal? If that's fake and that's false, then how do we know any of it's true? Then how do we know Jesus is true? And then. Hopefully you see where I'm going here. There's plenty of people who don't believe parts of the Bible, plenty of people who didn't have all the Bible. There's plenty of people who've literally only heard the gospel of Jesus, which means that all the other parts of the Bible could be false. They still heard what they needed to hear, and they loved Jesus, and they were saved. That's not a good argument to say that the Bible has to all be true. It's not a good argument to say that everything needs to be literal. Now, that does not mean that there aren't good arguments for those things, but that is not a good one to say that if the Bible's not all true, if any of it's not true, then all of it could be not true. That's not a good argument. That's just a slippery slope. It's a logical fallacy. It's something that should be avoided. Okay, on to systematic theology. All right, if we allow people to believe, this is a big one. One theological difference, and soon they're also going to change their beliefs about this, and that, whatever. So usually this is like in church who to want to keep people who from believing stuff other than what the church believes. So usually it'll be like, maybe the church is not for same-sex marriage. They're against same-sex marriage. And someone in the church is like, well, I think I read the scripture differently. Well, they want to disassociate from that person. They want to tell that person they're wrong. They want to correct them. And sometimes there's good reasons because, hey, the Bible says otherwise, and we think this is dangerous belief, whatever. But sometimes it's, well, we think if you disagree with us here, then later you're going to disagree with us about salvation. Or later you might disagree with us about the Holy Spirit. Later you might disagree with us about how the church should meet or how we spend our finances. And it's a bunch of what ifs. If you disagree with us here, what if you disagree with us in all these other scenarios? But a what if is not a logical connection. It's not a through line. It's not reasonable. Someone can disagree with you in one spot and still agree with you on all of the other things. There's no systematic reason to believe that they disagree here, they'll disagree other places. Now, we can turn this around though. If they don't agree with you on who or what God is, or if they don't agree with you about God at all, if they say God is not real, well, I don't think it's a slippery slope to say, well, then they might disagree with you about Jesus. Well, they do, because Jesus is God. If you believe that Jesus is God, they don't believe God is real, then you can kind of see logically they should not believe that Jesus is God because they do not believe God is real. But that is giving you a reasonable through line where you could see their reasoning and evaluate it case by case, rather than saying, well, this thing, then. Use their reasoning, evaluate it for what it is, and then see if it can consistently still be applied to other things, and whether or not the disagreement is only in one area, or if you think it needs to be discussed because it could lead to other areas. For example, going back to the same-sex marriage thing, I think it's reasonable to ask somebody, I wouldn't assume of anybody, that if they said they believe same-sex marriage is okay and you do not, you might hold a view of biblical inerrancy that they do not hold. Because that is a big reason why people disagree on that. Sometimes some people say, well, this part of the Bible maybe wasn't right about this. Maybe they misunderstood something. And you think the Bible's right about everything. They do not. There was no way to misunderstand. But there's no way to know unless you ask and engage with people on what their actual reasoning is, rather than saying, because you hold this belief, you have to hold all these other beliefs. That's not true. Some people believe in biblical inerrancy and the same-sex marriage is okay. It's difficult. You got to look at Matt Vine's work if you want to see how people are kind of doing some of that. But I don't agree with that. But it is possible. So you have to engage with people's reasonings, evaluate it for what it is, and not make assumptions and not do the slippery slope arguments. That's how we uphold Christian unity, by really hearing one another out for what we actually believe, what we're actually reasonably saying, rather than making an assumption. I believe if we remove this kind of thought, if we remove the kind of fear that, oh, if they disagree with us here, then they're going to disagree with us and all this other thing. If we remove that, then I think we'll have more free thought in the church, people who are able to actually challenge us, say, hey, man, I don't know if I agree with this part of the Bible. I don't know if I agree with you here. We're able to have these discussions and grow better as Christians because we're engaging one another for what we're actually saying. We're having open minds to see Scripture for what it is, to be logical creatures of faith who love God, want to know Him better, love Him better, and love one another better by actually engaging with one another's thoughts, one another's real arguments, rather than making up what if scenarios. That's how we grow. That's how we challenge one another to be more like Jesus. It's by being able to see one another for what we are, our arguments for what they are, look at the reasoning behind it, not make assumptions, not assume a slippery slope, and attack that. Okay. After talking about unity, I'm going to talk about why Al Mohler is wrong about some things. Al Mohler is the president of the Southern Baptist Seminary. Yeah, Southern Baptist Seminary. I feel like I'm missing a word there. Doesn't matter to me. Christian Ashley, correct me in the comments somewhere. Christian Ashley goes to the Southern Baptist Seminary that Al Mohler is part of. He has a podcast. I don't want to tell you the day because, you can look it up for yourself. And I don't want to be seen as supporting Al Mohler or his podcast. I do not support him. I don't support his thoughts. I think he probably is a Christian, but I think he is a Christian with a lot of flaws who maybe doesn't understand reasoning. And maybe he has a lot of room to learn about love. That's just my personal opinions. I don't not particularly fond of him. I do think he's a Christian. I just don't recommend him to anybody. But on one of his podcasts recently, he said that part of why the Methodist Church now is same-sex affirming is because they started letting women preach. That is, in fact, a slippery slope argument. Say, because you let women preach, now you're going to start allowing same-sex couples, and then who knows what's next? You're going to allow this, and then this, and then this, and then this. That is a logical fallacy. That is not a way to engage in our faith. It's not a way to engage with arguments of others. It's not loving. It's not logical. It's just completely unreasonable. Especially when he's talking about the Methodist Church, who's going through a split, and half of the church, who still allows women to preach, are upholding what their traditional view of marriage is. They are saying that marriage should be between one man and one woman. The other half is saying it shouldn't. And he's only focusing on half of it to make his slippery slope argument to try and use fear to keep other people from allowing women preachers because he doesn't agree with it. So he uses faulty reasoning to try to manipulate people to believing like he does. That's just my take. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe he really believes this and just doesn't see why he's illogical. I think he's smarter than that. I think he knows what he's doing. I think he's just being manipulative. Personally, that's just my personal opinion. He also has recently, we're going to go back to slippery slope arguments for a little bit, but while we're talking about Al Mohler, I also want to air out another grievance. He has used a straw man argument. We talked about straw man arguments last time. We're talking about the other people's views on God's providence. So recently there was an assassination attempt on the president, Donald Trump, former president of the United States. And he's talking about how providence kept him from getting shot. And he says there's only three views of providence. And this is like in his view. He says there's only three views of providence. That's people like him who believe in total providence, something like deism, where salvation is impossible, or one where God picks and chooses when to intervene without taking any real responsibility. That's a straw man argument. So if you remember, straw man is when you misrepresent the other person's argument to make it easier to attack them. So he's representing one view where God isn't fully engaged, saying that's just deism. That's saying that God's completely hands off. There's a lot of people who believe for one reason or another that God does not directly intervene. And a lot of them aren't deists. A lot of them are Christians. A lot of them believe in salvation. They believe in salvation maybe differently than he does, but they still believe in salvation. The other one, he says, God picks and chooses when to intervene without taking any real responsibility. Well, I'm a friend of Dr. Tom Ord, who believes in a lot of this open relational thinking, who believes God isn't all powerful. And because of that, he believes God works with us to see love done in the world. So it's not that God's picking and choosing, but rather it's the idea is that God works with us. And if we choose not to work with God, then God cannot work with us to cause love to occur in the world. I'm not saying that I agree or disagree with Thomas Ord, not saying I agree or disagree with Al Mohler's view on providence. I am saying that the way he framed the argument is a straw man argument where he misrepresented the other sides to attack their beliefs. That's not how it works. It's illogical. Again, it's unkind and it's unreasonable. So that's my view on some of what Al Mohler's been saying recently. If you also want a more logical fallacies, listen to Al Mohler more. He uses at least once a day, in my opinion. But I could be wrong. I try to be kind. I'm not a big fan. That's all. But on to historical theology. We're going to talk some about that. Iconoclasm is another example of how slippery slopes have been used in the church for ill, in my opinion. There was big attacks on iconoclastic use, which is the use of images in worship. Usually, these kind of icons that represent something. The icon itself, and we talked about this on Whole Church once. If you go back, maybe I'll put a link down below. Father Jonathan talked a lot about the use of icons in the Greek Orthodox Church. But different parts of this image, like what you're seeing on the screen, represent something else. It's saying something different about, in this case, Jesus, but a lot of times it's saints. A halo might represent one thing. Being bald represents something. Having a patch of hair in one spot represents something. What they're doing with their hands represents something. And it was originally used for people who couldn't read. These images were telling them something about their history, about the Bible, about Jesus that they couldn't get otherwise because they couldn't read. And these uses of images were powerful, and they still are powerful today for people who are able to connect with them and experience the divine, maybe in a way different than we're used to. A lot of people might just be used to song and worship or reading the Bible, but there are other ways to engage with the divine. But there have been attacks in the history of the church against iconoclastic images. Usually, it's a fear that this use of image, that the image itself will become what's worshipped rather than helping others worship. So the fear would be seeing this image and I'm worshiping and I'm praying to the image rather than seeing the image and learning something about the divine, something about God, something about these saints and using it to enhance my worship. I could start worshiping the image itself or the statue itself. A lot of times statues are also used. And some of this other types of worship where you're thinking about and learning about things in ways other than just words and song. But that undermines a lot of the reasons images are used in worship. A lot of it has to do with learning. A lot of it has to do with seeing what our history is and learning from the way the picture is laid out. It has nothing to do with worshiping the image, right? So logically, you can't say because there is an image, someone will worship that image. There might be other reasons you have, but just the fear that the image being there will lead to these happening, which will lead to people not worshiping God anymore, which will lead to then. See the fallacy. So I think that's something that the church has learned from some, where it was mistaken, and it's attacks against icons being used. And some churches still have icons. I think it's a good thing to have. At the very least, I hope that our fellow Protestant brother and sisters will not attack churches who have icons because you think they're worshiping the image. It's not what's happening. It's just a slippery slope argument that was used once upon a time in church history where we were mistaken. And I hope that we've learned from and can move past that. So that's that. That's our slippery slope argument. And now, you guys know I like to end our show with 3 takeaway questions, not actions. That's not what the show is about. We're not here to give you what to do. We're not here to tell you what to think. We're here to give you questions to think about deeper. So 3 questions for people to study and to ponder on their own. Number 1, how might the fear of the slippery slope have kept me from understanding someone else's point of view and loving them better in the past. So try to think of a time before where maybe you use a slippery slope argument to undermine someone else and not really hear out what they were saying, what they're thinking, what their beliefs were. Maybe one of the examples from earlier above. They're trying to take away my rights, and then. Or, well, if they don't agree with me here, then they're not going to agree here, then. If you can think of a moment in your life where you use the then argument, reflect on that. How has your fear of the slippery slope kept you from understanding someone else's point of view and from loving them better? Number 2, do I engage with politics only because of a slippery slope argument? Am I only voting for who I vote for because I think the other side will do this, which will lead to this, then this? So it's a big question. Do you engage with politics only because of a slippery slope argument? And then number 3, how can I help fellow believers who might be holding themselves back because of a fear of the slippery slope? So maybe I know someone else who is afraid that the current political situation is going to cause this, and that's going to cause this, and then. Or maybe they think that if you allow someone to drink, then they're going to become a drunk. And then being a drunk is a sin, and then they're going to fall away from God completely, and then they're going to go to hell, and then. How can you help fellow believers who might be holding themselves back? Maybe they're not living their full freedoms. They're afraid to go bowling because maybe they'll become a sinner. How can you help your fellow believers who might be holding themselves back because of the fear of a slippery slope? So that's our 3 questions. One more time. How might my fear of the slippery slope have kept me from understanding someone else's point of view and loving them better in the past? Number 2, do I engage with politics only because of a slippery slope argument? And number 3, how can I help fellow believers who may be holding themselves back because of a fear of the slippery slope? All right, and there you have it. Those are our 3 takeaway questions. I hope you guys will go wrestle with those, think about them on your own time. And I hope you're all just as confused as I am, and that you're inspired to learn from the church's past, to challenge your own beliefs and reject heresy that may be based on fallacy, like the slippery slope fallacy, going forward in your own faith journeys. Thank you all for joining this dummy on my journey to learn more about God and to love Him better. And I hope this has encouraged you to worship God in your own thinking. And of course, to keep on struggling.
This was an Anazao Ministries podcast. If you'd like to check out other shows like this, be sure to subscribe to the network.